to everyone who is joining us today. Marina was just telling me before we went live about the great response we had to this topic, and that thrills me because you're going to hear me talk a lot about what I believe is the right way to go about planning a new website. So hopefully this means that we have a lot of people who see a new website on your horizon in the coming months or maybe next year that really want to go about this in a strategic way with a solid foundation. So thank you for coming and participating in this today. Very quickly about me. My name is Marlene Oliveira, as Marina said, and I'm a copywriter and communications consultant. I work exclusively with nonprofit organizations. I also created the Nonprofit Mar Community blog a few years ago, and that's a space where nonprofit communicators help each other by blogging and sharing their insights and their experience with how to do all aspects of nonprofit marketing communications. So I do encourage you to head over to that blog after the webinar, and you'll find articles about how to do, everything from producing a video to strategy level topics. And then along with that, when I launched the blog in 2013, I also launched a monthly Twitter chat called NPMC Chat. So on the last Thursday of every month, it's another opportunity for communicators to get together and have a conversation. This month, we're talking about building marketing communications budgets. So if you're interested in any of that, you can check it all out, get all of the details on the Nonprofit Mar Community blog. Now, I mentioned that I focus on copywriting and content creation in my business, and with a further focus on storytelling, on branding, and on digital content. I've been running this business since 2008. And I thought, since we're talking about websites today, and I have so many nonprofit communications pros listening, I have a few questions for you. So I'm planning this new website, and I wondered if you would weigh in and let me know what you think. First of all, I have a question about the colors. What color palette do you like more? I've got color palette #1 and color palette 2 there from my designer. And I'm just looking for some feedback on which one you think is better. I'm also a little bit, have mixed feelings about where to put my portfolio on my website. I'm wondering, do you think I should put it in the main navigation or in a drop down from the main navigation, or maybe it should live in the header or footer of the site? And then the third thing I'm looking for opinions on is the sidebar. So what should go in my sidebar? Should it be the search, an email sign up button to get people to sign up for my newsletter, and Facebook widget, and what order should they go in? I'm just looking to get some feedback on that. Now, do you find it weird that I'm asking you these questions? It should be weird, because I'm just kidding, because of course I wouldn't do this webinar and feel your input, but I'm asking you these questions to make a point. It would be hard for you to weigh in on any of that. And by the way, I'm not building a new website. Those were all from my existing website. But even though you are nonprofit communicators, you don't have any context for helping me with these decisions. The context that you do not have is a website content strategy. You don't understand the background, the basis from which I would be making any of those decisions. There's also the question of, even though you may be a communicator, are you trained in graphic design? Are you trained in website development or design? Are you an expert on user interface? And I'm making a point because sometimes we go to our colleagues when we're building websites and we ask questions like the ones I just asked you, and they don't have the expertise that I just listed, and they don't have the context of a proper strategy. So that's why we're talking about website content strategy today, so that you do have the right context for planning your new nonprofit website. There's a book that I really recommend called Content Strategy for the Web. And this isn't the definition of content strategy from that book, but this is an important sentence that I think really highlights why I'm talking about what we're talking about today. So this sentence is, content strategy helps us to find ways to better understand all aspects of our content, which means that we can make smarter, more informed decisions about how we're going to select and execute our tactics. The smarter, more informed decisions are what it's all about. When you have a content strategy in place, you have a framework to make decisions down the road, weeks and months down the road as you're planning your site. You have a framework for making design decisions, development decisions, Of course, it's a context for making your content decisions. When you work on a website content strategy in a collaborative way, you're creating an opportunity for alignment and consensus in your organization. And then most importantly, when you have a content strategy in place, you're going to build a better, more effective website. You're going to build a website that supports your organization's goals. You will have a written guide for the content you develop now and in the future. And that's a guide that you can share with anyone who's creating content for your website. You're also creating a website that connects your organization's purpose and the content that you produce with the users, the visitors to your site, and their needs. It can be a bit intimidating to embark on a tech project if you're not particularly tech savvy. So something I want to impress upon you today is that website planning is communications planning. The same principles apply. You have to understand the strategy first, and then you plan the delivery, and in this case, the technology around it. So a lot of what I'm going to go over today might not seem brand new to you. It should be familiar to you. It's just applied to the context of planning a website. So I'm just bringing back up this slide about me to reiterate the fact that I am a content specialist. I run the Nonprofit Mark Community blog. I run a blog on my site, but I don't have technical expertise when it comes to building websites. However, I have been doing this consulting work for 10 years, and for 6 years before that, I was an in-house manager of communications for a large health charity. So I've either been through or helped clients with the content side of many website builds or redesigns. And because of that, I've seen what happens when content comes last. Content should come first. And yes, I am a content specialist. Of course, I would say that. So throughout the presentation today, I'm bringing in some insights from a friend of mine, Mike Mella, who is a web designer and developer. And here's the first insight. Mike says, your content is not simply a replacement for placeholder text. It's the thing that gets designed. So anyone who has built an entire website and then added in the text at the end, replacing their placeholder copy, understands what Mike is getting at here. It's not something you swap in at the last minute. It's the thing that gets designed. So that's why today, in this introductory level webinar, I'm going to show you how to put content first. We started to explore the benefits of having a content strategy, and of course, they go far beyond content planning. They extend to design and development. And then we're going to look at the elements of a website content strategy, and I'll touch on how to build your strategy and some examples from nonprofits who have benefited from a content-first approach. So a question that I think is worth asking and answering frequently is why. We should always be asking ourselves why. I have a little girl, and here's a picture of her when she was in the but why stage. That stage where toddlers or preschoolers are questioning the why to everything. But she's getting older now, as she's 6, and as she is trying to learn and make sense of things around her, I'm encouraging her to ask herself why. Of course, to ask me why as well, but to ask herself why so that she is making decisions based on good reasons and clear thinking. And I think that that is something we can all benefit from doing more often. To bring it back to the context of a website content strategy, when you start with a website content strategy, you will be answering all of the whys up front. But why this color choice? But why is this in the navigation? You'll be answering that all up front. And so then when you're planning your new website, with each decision that you need to make, your website content strategy should have the answers to why. So let's see if you already have some of those answers now. I have a little exercise for you. Assuming that you are here because you're planning a new website in the coming months or maybe next year, I'm going to ask you a few questions, and I'm going to invite you to write down your answers as we go along. So if you want to just get something handy, a pen and paper, or if you just at your computer, you'll take some notes. Just get ready to answer the following questions. The first question is this: what does your website need to achieve? Why are you building or redesigning your website? What does it need to achieve for your organization? So I'm just going to pause and stop talking for a moment so you can write this down. And as you're writing, I'm going to ask you to look at your answer, and if you happen to have written down awareness or building awareness, I'm going to ask you to please cross that out and try to get more specific. And then I'm going to bring up the second question. Question 2, who are your priority audiences? Who are you hoping will visit this website? Once again, I'm going to pause. I know I'm not giving you a lot of time, but just write what comes to mind immediately when I ask you, who are your priority audiences? And in this case too, I'm going to ask you to look at what you wrote, and if you wrote down the general public or all of our stakeholders or something really big like that, please cross it out and try to get more specific than that. And then question number 3, what do you need your website to say? What are the key messages it needs to communicate? So because I'm not giving you a lot of time, you might be able to reflect on your organization's key messages and which ones your website will be responsible for communicating, if that's something your organization has already articulated. What does your website need to say? And then the last of my questions for this little exercise, question number 4. What are the most important actions visitors will take on the site, on your new site? What actions do you want visitors to take? Okay, so again, I know this was quick, and obviously you are going to revisit this after this webinar, but have a look at what you've written down in response to these questions. And I want to ask you, did the answers come easily for you? If they did come easily for you, then you have some of the building blocks of your website content strategy in place right now. And if there are any blanks, or if it was mostly blanks, then let's break this down a little bit further. Oops, I missed my next slide. How did you do? So let's break this down a little further. Elements of a website content strategy. So the first thing I want to say about your website content strategy is that it's a document. It's as simple as that. It doesn't have to be particularly long or even very detailed, depending on your organization, but it should be 3 things. It should be written down. It should reflect your best thinking, research, and consultation. And it should include the following elements, starting with number 1, your website's purpose. If you're planning a new website, you should have a more specific communications objective than we need a new site or the existing site is old. What is it that you want your website to achieve? Since your website exists to advance your organization toward achieving your vision and mission, you need to connect your site back to specific organizational goals. And you'll find those goals, I hope you'll find those goals in your nonprofit strategic plan. And looking at your strategic plan and identifying those goals, you can then take the next step of articulating the communications objectives you intend to accomplish through your website and your website's content. So I want to bring up an example. I'm going to bring it up a few times during this presentation of a client that I've worked with on website content strategy. So I worked with Marcus Stadelman-Elder at Maytree. He's the director of communications there. And Maytree does work, if you don't already know who Maytree is, what the organization is about, they do work in the area of poverty reduction. And Marcus and I started working together on their content strategy once the organization had established a new mission and a new strategic direction, and they had gone through a rebranding. And Marcus realized that they needed a new website that reflected this new mission and new strategic direction. And he had a few clear purposes for their new website. He needed the website to highlight Maytree's work and that of its partners. He needed the website to highlight Maytree's latest thinking, and the organization needed the site to provide access to training and tools, to provide their visitors with access to training and tools. So if you were to dig back deeper and further, you would find out, you would discover that these purposes identified for the website relate back to specific strategic goals for the organization. And this was our starting point. When you know the objectives you need your website to meet, you'll know what your content needs to achieve. And then you can figure out outcomes, which we're going to talk about shortly. And this all comes together to providing you with an understanding of the types of content you need and how each piece of content can support your organization's objectives and your communications objectives. All right, the second element is your priority audiences. You should not be making any content decisions until you have identified who your priority audiences are. So yes, you will need to stop thinking about the general public and narrow this down. You'll need to identify and then prioritize. The number of audiences you prioritize will, of course, depend on the size and scope and complexity of your organization, but try to narrow this down as much as you can. And you need to be really honest with yourself. Oh, and I see if my first typo of the day, I hope I don't have any others that I see on the slide there. You need to be honest with yourself about which relationships you will and won't facilitate through your actual website. There may be other better ways of reaching some of your other audiences. I apologize for that. This is when you look at content for too long and you need a proofreader. I don't have my own proofreader here. All right, so the Maytree audiences, when we were going through this project with Marcus and I, were these three priority audiences: people working in government and other policymakers, community and agency-based emerging leaders, and executive directors and other leaders of nonprofit organizations. So like many organizations, Maytree could have had a list 100 audiences long, 100 groups long, but they knew there were these three audiences that were a priority for the new website. But these are still groups of people. And the next step you need to take when you're creating your strategy is to create marketing personas. You need to create an individual marketing persona for each of your priority audiences. You need to spend time developing and thinking about your audience to understand their motivations and their priorities. So you need to explore and understand things like, why are members of this audience visiting your site? What are their information wants and needs? What questions are they trying to answer or get answered when they visit your website? What tasks have they come to your website to perform? Now, there are a lot of questions that you will want to explore about your audiences. And I find that a good way to do this for many nonprofit organizations is to have conversations with those internal stakeholders who know their groups best, the people they're serving best. So I've created this little guide for everyone on this webinar. It's the guide to conducting interviews with internal stakeholders. And I will bring the slide back up at the end of the presentation if you don't have a chance, but I've given you 2 pages worth of questions to ask your internal stakeholders to help understand, among other things, your audiences. The thing that you want to do is that you want to give your website visitors an experience that makes them stay and read and possibly take action. And to do that, you need to give them what they want. And to give them what they want, you have to get to know them. There's another reason that this audience identification and prioritization and then marketing persona development work is going to benefit you. It's related, but it's going to help you avoid the mistake of being too inwardly focused when making website decisions. You need to have your ideal visitors, not just your board or your senior management team or your colleagues or your own assumptions, at the forefront of all of your website decisions. And pardon me, I'm going to have a sip of water. It's much easier to focus on your audiences when you've created a vivid picture of who your audience members are. Excuse me. And when you've collaborated to develop this understanding, then your colleagues understand your audiences better as well and why it's so important to focus on them. I'm going to take a pause for another sip of water. I'm just going to ask Marina, is everything sounding okay and are we good?
Yes, Marlene, everything's going great. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. My throat is lubricated and I've avoided the situation I have had once before of talking too long without realizing I dropped off. My audio had dropped off. So let's look at what Mike, to go to a web development point of view, has to say about this audience persona development. Mike says that creating personas for your audiences puts you and your developer on the same page as far as knowing how to present your website's content. Everyone has the same clear examples of what your target audiences look like. Visualizing this helps your developer to present navigation or content in a way that's appropriate for each visitor's journey through the site. All right, let's move to the next element, which is voice and tone. Something you want to articulate in your website content strategy is what the voice and tone of your website copy and other content like videos or audio that you might be including, or visuals, what will it be? Now, as a general rule, conversational copy that's written in an active voice works well for the web. It should always be free of jargon as well. And then I'll add to that you should be writing in a way that reflects your organization's specific brand personality. Now, if you've gone through a branding exercise, you will already have this articulated, or you should have your brand personality articulated. If you don't have this, this is a good time to do it. If your organization doesn't have a clearly defined brand personality, when you're planning your website, might be a good time to develop one. If you don't know what I mean, I want to give you a few examples. You might want your nonprofit's personality to come across as funny and accessible. Or maybe that doesn't work for your organization and you need to come across as serious and matter of fact. Or an alternative, maybe your organization wants the personality it reflects to be respectful, but still enthusiastic. So these are just a few examples, and there are many elements that you might be considering as part of your personality, many personality attributes. Conversational, active voice, and jargon-free can apply to any of these, but then you add this layer of personality to your voice. I want you to think about those examples that I shared and how voice and tone might affect your website's design. So your brand personality and the voice and tone of your content could shape development and design decisions like the fonts that you use on your website, the color scheme that you select, the imagery that you feature on your site. And of course, we're talking content, so your personality should come through in your main pages of copy, your core content, every blog post that's written for your site. Whenever you craft a call to action, your personality can come through. Other micro copy on your site. So voice and tone are really important. Element number 4 are your website's key messages. Now, you're probably used to articulating key messages for your communications campaigns, and I believe it's very worthwhile to articulate a few website key messages for each of the audiences that you have identified. So 1 to 2, maybe 3 key messages for each of your priority audiences. So you'll see that we're building on each element as we go. And for each of those audiences, I would encourage you to answer this question. If your website was a person speaking to a member of your priority audience, what would you want it to say? What would you want this person to say to that individual your website is speaking to? This might be a little bit hard to understand, so I'm bringing in an example from Maytree again. You might remember the 3 different audiences I highlighted, and for just one of these audiences, the sector leaders group, executive directors and other sector leaders, Marcus and Maytree articulated this out of 2 other key messages. You can come to us for a connection to a broader movement. Now, why do we want to do this? Here I'm turning to Mike to explain it from the other side. Articulating website key messages is a valuable exercise. Often we get caught up in the technical aspects of creating a website. Seeing your site as a person helps everyone involved in the project to remember its purpose, to deliver your message to real people. So that's from Mike at Be Like Water. Let's go to our next element, element number 5. You need to articulate the actions that you want people to take on the site, the outcomes that you're going to measure. So thinking about each of your audiences one at a time, consider what actions do you want visitors to take on your site? Decide what truly matters. You also need to think about what actions your visitors want to take, what they have come to take. I alluded to this earlier. When you're creating those marketing personas, you're going to get some of this information out of that exercise. And then remember that you have to balance the actions they want to take with those that will support your objectives, the objectives you identified. Now, it is possible that you could end up with a really, really long list, but you are trying to provide some strategy and some guidance to what is most important. So again, I really encourage you to prioritize. It doesn't mean that the other things are not going to happen, but it does mean you need to know what is most important for your new website. And I find it helpful to ask people to identify the top 3 actions that they want each individual audience to make or to take. So we'll prioritize and really try to whittle it down to the top 3. When working with Marcus and Maytree, there were a lot of different outcomes that they identified. And so this is a sampling to give you an understanding of what I mean. Things like an increase in newsletter subscribers, downloads and shares of certain papers and certain reports that they publish, that Maytree publishes, visits to and shares of certain articles, certain opinion pieces, opinion pages on their website, the number of event registrations and who was registering for certain events, and the relationships established, new relationships established that started on the website. So this is a sort of a laundry list, but Marcus and Maytree went the step further of picking what mattered most for each audience. So looking at this list, that audience I referred to before about executive directors, they really wanted executive directors to sign up for events. So that they have a 5 Good Events series, a 5 Good Ideas event series. That's what they wanted executive directors to sign up for, to subscribe to the Maytree electronic newsletter, and to share Maytree content and events with members of their network, maybe members of their team and their broader network. So I've given a list here, but they were much more specific per audience what really mattered. The reason this is so important is that when you hand your strategy over to your designer and your developer, and you have these outcomes clarified, then that professional can visualize your visitor's experience, and they can make informed decisions and recommendations about things like your navigation, your functionality, and features for each section of your website, and then for your website as a whole. And they can also determine things like the visual weight of individual elements. If you've built websites before, if you've gone through a website build or redesign before, you've probably come across situations where multiple internal stakeholders are fighting over, say, the homepage, or they're arguing over what belongs in the main navigation. So when you've done some of this prioritization work, and I'm not saying it's easy, you will have to find consensus and come to an agreement. But once you've prioritized and you hand it to your developer, the why is there. The decisions have been made based on your strategy. And so I've talked about how it can affect the layout or functionality of your site. But of course, back to content, when you have these outcomes identified, then you can figure out what content you need to produce or develop in order to guide visitors to your site down the right path, from what page to what page to what action. You'll know also what calls to action to include with each article that you write, or each blog post that you publish, or you might feature this on other pages of content. So that leads us to the priority topics or content areas. So based on everything we've done so far, and you can hopefully see how it's all building, starting with our purpose and making decisions that layer on top of that. With the work you've done so far, you're going to be able to make smart decisions about the actual content you need in terms of priority topics or content buckets that you're going to feature on your website. You're going to be able to start to answer questions about what topics related to your cause or your issue do you need to feature? What content do you need to create in order to explain your organization, the work you do, the services and the programs that you offer? You'll be able to figure out what content you need to publish to explain how people can support that work and how people can get involved with your organization. And you can then think about what else you need to write about your people, your partners, other supporters, what else? From here, this is where you are going to make a plan for your launch content. So the main core content that you're going to produce or revise or repurpose now for your brand new website or your redesigned website, but also it will guide the ongoing content you're going to need to produce, the content you're going to need to update, the new blog posts that you'll publish if you have a blog on your site. So after the webinar, if you go over to the Maytree website and have a look around, you'll see their content strategy reflected in the areas of focus on their website. So it might be what they choose to feature in the news and updates. I took a screen capture that has a little bit of a drop down there so that you can see what's in their navigation and what's in some of their drop down. But based on their content strategy, they knew that some of the areas they needed to focus on in terms of buckets were about Maytree content, information about policy and insights about poverty. They knew they wanted a section featuring opportunities to learn and tools to use in poverty reduction, and stories of change. So stories about the work in action, the work that they're trying to help people with in action. I'm going to turn over to a quote from Mike again here. Establishing priority topics helps you and your web developer to see the big picture of how your site will grow over time, where it's headed, and what's needed to get it there. So it's important not just for this launch date that's looming, that's coming up for you, but it's also important to make sure that the site that you do build is going to serve you well over time. And I'm going to share a couple of examples in a moment that really kind of refer back to this point about how your site will grow over time and what you need to have in place to get it there. But my question for you right now is, are you feeling ready to plan your new site? I'm hoping that you're feeling like, even if you do not have technical expertise, you're understanding what the first steps are that you need to take to plan your site. It can be quite daunting, but when you invest in these carefully laid plans, it's worth it. Now, I have to tell you that, unfortunately, not many nonprofits are doing it this way. In my experience, not many nonprofits are doing it this way. I have seen many times when clients come to me after a site has been fully built and they are looking to fill, I've got the word fill in quotes, that website with content. So they put content last. And as I prepared for this presentation, I actually put a call out to my network on social media, through email, asking for anyone who works at a nonprofit and has launched a site in the last year or so, who started with content and content strategy, to share their examples with me, and it was crickets. I didn't receive a single response that I could use in this presentation. So I did turn over back to Mike and to another friend of mine, another friend and web developer, Yesenia Sotelo at Smart Cause Digital, and they helped me with some of their client projects that did start with content. So Yesenia at Smart Cause, you can see her logo in the bottom right corner. When I asked her, I have to share that, and she gave me permission to share, that when I asked her the question, actually this is how I worded the question to her. When I said to her, can you share with me an example of an organization that's come to you in the last year or so with content or a content strategy in place, she just laughed because it is very much the exception. But she did have these two examples. And she told me she had these two examples, and these are websites from Everyday Democracy and the Nonprofit Leadership Alliance. So I do encourage you to go over and check out their sites after the webinar. But she had these two in mind, and she commented that these two organizations are good at communications in general, and that because they came prepared in terms of strategy, their websites are holding up over time. So she couldn't give me a build in the last year, but these sites are a little bit older, but they're holding up over time because they started with a content strategy, or they started with strategy. And Yesenia asked me to also point out, or she commented to me, that organizations that come to her as a web developer save money when they do come well prepared. They save money and they spend more when they don't come prepared with a website content strategy. Over to Mike. He had a couple of examples of organizations. This one is a website that he built for the Alberta Association of Midwives. And he told me that they came really prepared with an understanding of their target audiences, their priority audiences. So they had three: midwives who are already registered members of the organization, prospective midwives, and families who are expecting and who are looking for a midwife. And they came with a clear understanding of those three audiences and their content requirements. For example, midwives wanted to see job opportunities, and families wanted to be able to find a midwife. And Mike said that because they had put so much thought into their audiences and they came so prepared, they even came with professional photography, which you can see here, which helped him to have a vision on an engaging design for their website. Okay, so the other example Mike shared with me is a microsite for the Canadian Pediatric Society. And Mike told me that they had already defined their priority audiences as well. They also had their brand fully thought out, including logo and color scheme and content for every page of the site, including captions for any illustrations that required them. So from a developer's point of view, he said he had everything he needed to create a compelling layout, and he wasn't fitting content in after the fact. So I've given you a number of examples. You can go back and have a look at those websites to see what happens when you put content first. So let's quickly recap the website content strategy elements. I've gone over 6. So first, your website's purpose, your priority audiences, the voice and tone for your site, your website key messages, the desired actions or outcomes, and your priority topics or content buckets, the content that's needed. So I've spent most of our time today talking about the elements that you need to include in your content strategy. And depending on how you do your work, with those elements that I've outlined, you might be ready to go ahead and create your own strategy. But in case you feel like you need some help with knowing how to figure this all out, I'm going to touch on some important steps that I believe you should include. But first, I want to reiterate something I said earlier on. Remember that your website content strategy, it's just a document. It doesn't need to be intimidating. It's a simple document that captures your best thinking, planning, and consultation. But documenting these things is the key. And then keeping in mind that a strong website content strategy is built on research and on consultation. Here are some of the steps I believe that you should take to get there. You should start with a content audit. You need to start knowing what content you already have, what you can reuse, what you need to repurpose or revise, and what you need to create. So you start with a content audit to understand what you have. Another step that I think is extremely important is that you need to get familiar with your organization's strategic plan. So dust it off if it needs dusting off. If it's not something you think to turn to as a communicator, turn to it now and get familiar with the strategic plan and your strategic goals. You need to have one-on-one conversations with internal stakeholders and meaningful internal conversations. You know, one of the things I really don't believe in as a valuable step in your web planning process is committee meetings, designing a website or planning your website content by committee. Instead, I highly recommend in-depth interview-style one-on-one conversations. And I'm going to bring that guide back up in a moment to help you with that. I strongly encourage you to review all available and relevant data that you already have. I find that many nonprofits are rich with information that they're just not thinking of tapping into for this type of project. So think about your website analytics or your email analytics. Think about any reader surveys you may have done as a publisher of a blog or a newsletter. Look at program evaluations, or if your organization has volunteers do evaluations of their experiences with you. If you do donor surveys, what does your organization already have in hand that you can consult to understand everything that we've gone over today, including your audiences? And then, of course, I reiterate this anytime I talk about basically any communications project, but you need to understand your prospective visitors. And I believe that creating those marketing personas that I mentioned is key to this. And then if you can go a step further and have one-on-one conversations with a few people from each of these audience groups or these visitor groups so that you can ask them some of the same questions and check any assumptions that your internal team may have. So those are some of the broader sort of steps that I think are involved. They're not necessarily in a particular order, but they're steps that are involved in developing your content strategy. And after you've developed your content strategy, you can move on to creating your detailed content plan. So far, we're 40 minutes in, and you may have wondered why the actual content, the pieces of content, just seem like one small element in the 6 elements that I discussed today. And there's a reason for that. And that reason is that I like to think of your content strategy as sort of a compass. It's a guide, or maybe it's a filter that all of your decisions have to go through. And you're going to have to make many, many different little detailed content decisions once your strategy is in place. So I find it helpful to think of these 2 separate documents. One is your content strategy, your compass, and then the other is your content plan. And maybe that's sort of, your map or your atlas, much more detailed. Once you've identified your priority topics in your strategy, you can create a detailed content plan, and that can be a document or some kind of table or spreadsheet. That's up to you in the style that you like to work in and the complexity of the content that you need to plan for. But in your content plan, that's where you're going to go through each of those priority topics or those content buckets that were the element number 6 in your strategy, and list for each of those, list out the specific pieces of content that you are going to need for each. So this could be specific pages of core website content. These might be blog posts that you're going to write over time. This might be micro copy that you need to include. So for buttons, for thank you pages on your website after someone's taken an action, if you have some banners or sidebar elements. It could be landing pages if you create landing pages for event registration or donation pages. And then next to each of those specific pieces of content, it's a good idea to add labels. So those labels would be the purpose. Relate this back again to the purpose of your website. Which purpose and what objectives does this piece of content align with? And also make a note about the user needs that are being met with this piece of content to keep the audience needs at the forefront. When you start developing this detailed content plan, you're making plans for your new website content, so make them realistic for launch day. Make realistic plans based on the time and resources that you actually have, and prioritize, once again, prioritize. Prioritize strategic, useful, and very relevant content over the bigger, longer list of wish list items, because you can always build on your strong foundation of core content later. And then you might want to get even more detailed with your content plan. You might be adding columns for timelines, reviews and revisions, responsibilities, who's responsible for each piece, approvals, who needs to be, who does the content need to go through, and have they approved it yet or not, to monitor your workflow. But add as many fields as you like and get as detailed as you like so you can get everything ready in time for the launch of your new website. Now, the content plan might seem more familiar to you. It might be something you were already planning on doing, because a lot of organizations do just jump straight to here. What content do we need? Let's make a list. But I really advise against that, because without that content strategy in place, what's guiding all of these decisions that you make? All right, so I'm getting ready to wrap it up here, and I'm asking you again, are you ready to do the work? This work is big. It's definitely big, even though the document might end up being very simple, and it definitely does take time. But your website content strategy, it really should be your starting point. I'm going to turn to Marcus here at Maytree for a comment that he made after going through the website content strategy development process. Marcus said, "The process is incredibly valuable and will save you so much time in the long run. You will have a much better understanding of what you're trying to do, and you'll have a much better understanding of whether your website is actually meeting your requirements." As marketers and communicators, we often talk about how difficult it is to measure the effectiveness of what we do, effectiveness of our tactics. And when you start with a website content strategy, you're giving yourself something to measure. You're giving yourself a standard against which to measure the effectiveness of your website. So I want to encourage you to look ahead to your website development plans and book time in your calendar now. You can bring in help from someone like me, or you can develop your strategy on your own. And depending on how you do that, and depending on the context of your organization, the people who need to be involved, how long it generally takes to approve things, like I said, better than I do, how long it will take you to do each step. But I would like to encourage you today, if there's one action you're going to take when you leave this webinar, is to book 6 weeks to draft your website content strategy before you even plan on talking to your web developer. So looking ahead, if you've got that website project coming up and you know when you need to start the development work, put about 6 weeks or more, if you think you're going to need it, of website content strategy development on your calendar. Some of those steps in a smaller organization or just a simpler existing website, the content audit alone, it could be a 1-week project or it could be a 6-week project. So you really need to look at all of the steps and all of the elements and really how quickly people turn things around for you. But I just really want to encourage you to put it on your calendar ahead of your website plans. And that's about it. I asked you to take action after the webinar and book your content strategy. I promised to bring back up this guide that I mentioned earlier in the presentation to help you with what I believe is one of the most important steps of all of the steps that I mentioned, which is that internal consultation. So this is a little guide. It's a 2-page guide. And in it, I've given you a long list of questions to work from in order to have really meaningful and fruitful and productive conversations with your colleagues about your upcoming website. And with that, actually, I will bring up my last screen, but I still have that information up there for you. That's what I've got for you today. I hope that I've sold you on the importance of website content strategy and that I've given you an understanding of how to do it and what it needs to include. So thank you so much for listening in, and we're going to move over to questions.
Wonderful. Thanks, Marlene. Amazing information and detailed information in today's webinar. So lots of great questions coming in as well. So we'll dive right in. First and foremost, you mentioned a few times doing a content audit. What is that and how do you get started with it?
Yes, so a content audit is not a very glamorous job, but it's very informative. So essentially, you're going to open up a spreadsheet, go through this. In this case, we're talking about a website content audit. You're going to go through your existing website and list out every single page or post on the site, and you're going to make notes about each piece of content. So you're going to include the name of the page, the URL for the page, information like who the author is, when was it last when was it published, when was it last updated. Notes maybe on if you already have a sense, if it needs to be deleted for your new site, if it needs to stay, if it needs to be updated because information is out of date. So there is an article on the Nonprofit Mark Community blog that I mentioned, and the author of this post is Mike, who I've referred to many times during this presentation. He did a nice, simple post over on the blog that outlines how to do a content audit, but it's an important starting point. I hope that answers the question.
That's great, and I'll just pop that link in the chat box momentarily in case anyone wants to check that out. Now we've had a couple of questions come in on just some definitions that perhaps you could clarify, Marlene. First of all, a microsite.
Yes, a microsite. So a lot of nonprofit organizations, this is a great question, a lot of nonprofit organizations will develop a separate website independent of their main site. And I believe it's normally either campaign-based, so it's a website dedicated to supporting the messaging of a specific time, usually time-limited campaign, or sometimes an organization will develop a microsite based on a topic that they just want it to all live in one robust place of its own. So the site that I showed during this presentation from the Canadian Pediatric Society was a microsite, an entire website dedicated to kids with diabetes in school. So it often happens when an organization really wants to shine a light on a specific topic, free from the distractions of everything else that they do. So feel that answers the question?
Yes, that's great. And now perhaps you could just clarify internal stakeholders versus external stakeholders.
Definitely. Oh, thank you. Another great question. So I should have put a slide up about that. So when I say internal stakeholders, I really mean people who are already connected to your organization and are involved, very involved. So as a communicator, when you're building a website, you're going to have to, and you should, involve your colleagues. So literally your coworkers in other departments or with other roles or functions. Internal stakeholders, depending on your organization, might include some leadership volunteers. It might include your boss. I think most nonprofits would shy away from this, but occasionally, depending on the organization, it might be a board member or two. It could be volunteers at a program level, but they are very autonomous in how they run programs. So in your case, it would replace a program manager that would be staff. So basically people who are already working with your organization. External stakeholders, I believe in this context for planning a website, you'd be thinking more about the people that your website needs to serve, but they aren't as closely involved in doing the work.
Great, and I just want to let everyone know that we are getting lots of feedback that I guess the links to Marlene's websites are not actually working at the moment, but I just want to assure everyone that we'll make sure that Marlene's obviously aware of that and we'll get those links working for you. But I can attest that both of the websites that she's mentioned today are excellent resources. We at Charity Village link to her articles quite often, and I do encourage you to check that out. You just give it a day or two, and these things happen. Websites go down. Even the Charity Village site goes down sometimes.
And you know what? I'm thinking I have a timing issue that I might even know what it is. For anyone who has gone through the process of improving the security of your website, we are doing some SSL certificate installed, and I'm thinking I should have made sure to say don't do any work while I'm on this webinar, because I suspect that's what's going on.
Awesome. And we've had a few people mention too that perhaps it's too much traffic even from
that's a perfect problem to have.
So there you go.
Please go back to visit it. Yes, thank you.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, so let's keep going here. Marlene, do you have thoughts on usability testing? Does that have a place when you're testing content? And if so, when and where would be the best time to do it?
Definitely. I think if you're hiring, when you get to the point of hiring your developer, you should absolutely make sure that they are including usability testing in their process. So it would fall much later than this work, than the content strategy work, but I'm glad people are asking about that, because it's so important. It's checking assumptions a lot of the time about what everybody wants on the site versus what will be a good user experience. So once you're working with your web developer.
Wonderful. Now, at the beginning, you mentioned a book about content strategy. Can you please just remind everyone who the authors of that are and the title?
Yes. So actually, why don't I quickly bring that slide back up? That might be the quickest way. Bear with me for just one moment so that you can have the right spelling. So there's the book name, Content Strategy for the Web. And this is why I brought it up. I know it's Christina Halverson. I'm not sure how to pronounce Melissa's last name. So now you can take that down. It's an excellent book. I'm glad people are interested in reading it.
Yeah, it sounds wonderful. Now let's jump into marketing personas. We've had a lot of questions about marketing personas. Can you just maybe give just a little bit more clarification on what those are?
Absolutely. So first, I would just recommend that you simply Google the term marketing persona after the webinar, so you can have some more in-depth reading. And anytime I do this, the top results are very informative. I think HubSpot will be one of the first results you're likely to get. But a marketing persona is where you take this big group of people. So let's say, using the Maytree example that we talked about, we're taking this group of executive directors working in agencies whose work may touch on poverty, let's say. And you try to create a description of an individual member of that audience. It's kind of a foreign concept, especially for people who are used to their organizations encouraging them to think about the general public. But you would literally look in that group and create a description of an individual. So you could give her or him a name. You could say, her name is Maria. She is 45. She works in an organization with 8 people. And you really get in depth painting this picture of this specific person. I know it can sound counterintuitive because you don't want to exclude anybody. But when you paint this really specific picture of one individual, you remember that your website needs to serve individuals. And when it's hyper relevant to sort of that ideal person that you really want to reach, it will be more useful and more engaging for the other audience members. So your persona should include, as I was starting to say, some demographic information. It should include some psychographic information about her values, her emotions, her passions, her day-to-day life, her priorities, her social environment, her cultural environment. And then I'm just going to go back to my slide with my guide. There are many questions you can explore about what she knows about your organization, what she needs to learn from your website, what actions she needs to take, that you will add to this persona. So if you read that guide, you basically have another guide to creating personas. It's just that I've structured it in a way that you're having a conversation with someone else about it. So I think I've probably answered that, but it's just a very, very valuable exercise to create a representative figure for each of your audience groups.
Great. And within that, now you're talking, Marlene, about really focusing down to an individual level, but how would you consider diversity within a marketing persona? Because, you know, there would be diversity there.
Absolutely. So you might want to develop, you know, more than one persona within an audience group. It's a really good question. I think you as an organization need to look at your objectives and who it is in particular you're trying to reach, because for some organizations, it is sort of a specific cultural group they're trying to reach, or a specific language group that they're trying to reach. It's not perfect because it doesn't include everything, you're right, but it's just an exercise in remembering real people at the other end of your communication.
Wonderful. Now, we had an interesting question come in through Twitter, so I wanted to get to that one. What if your organization voice doesn't actually match the tone that you've decided should be used for your target audience in your content?
Wow, that, well, to me, that would be a big problem. To me, that would be a big problem if you've gotten, if the organization has established and articulated a voice, and then you go through this exercise of understanding your audiences and there's a mismatch, that to me signals a need for a rebrand if you're no longer relevant to the people, if it's no longer a fit with the people you need to serve. Now, it may not be all bad news. It might be that at the brand level, there was a voice that was established, and it may not necessarily, your website might really be for a sub-segment of all of your audiences. But that would raise some red flags for me if there was that much of a disconnect.
Good stuff. Now, I think our final question for today, we've had a couple of people asking about accessibility and how that, you know, feeds into all of this. And certainly there's some, you know, increasing even legislation in Ontario, for instance, around this. So do you have any tips or suggestions or information on where people could go for more resources on that?
Yes, I'm glad you gave me the options of more resources, because this is not an area of expertise for me. It doesn't usually touch my work in the strategy side. It comes more at the development level. But if the Nonprofit Marketing Community blog is loading now a little quicker, hopefully it is. One of our most recent articles on that site is a post about accessibility. And it was a very, you know, very basic introductory level post about some things you can do to improve accessibility. But within that blog post are a number of resources to dive deeper and learn more about accessibility on the web. I'm so glad that post was recently published.
That's great. And I want to thank you, Marlene, again for an amazing presentation. I know that, you know, this is certainly an interesting topic, and one that from our registration numbers today, I can say that a lot of folks across Canada are interested in learning more about. So we're really pleased to have you here presenting for us again. And I do really encourage everyone to check out Marlene's websites, because as I said, there's a lot of really, really great information there. So any last words, Marlene, before we close off?
Just to thank you in return for having me, and thanking everyone for hanging in right till the end of this webinar, and really to thank everyone for being so interested in website content strategy. It's very encouraging. So thank you so much.
Wonderful. So just before we sign off today, I do want to remind everyone we will follow up with you by email with the webinar recording. I am going to say watch for that by early next week. Charity Village ourselves may be undergoing some website renovations this weekend, so we may hold off on sending that email out to you until early next week, just to ensure that you don't wind up with any broken links or anything like that. But we will get it out to you as soon as we can. We will also include a link there to a short survey. If you can just take a moment to fill that out, that helps us for future content. You'll have an opportunity there to also let us know if there's other topics you'd like to see covered in a future session. You can let us know if you'd like us to try to bring Marlene back for another session next year. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Bye.